everybody. Welcome back to the Mythgard Academy. So glad to be starting another book discussion as we continue our progress through the history of Middle-earth. I remember the days when people used to tease me that, like, someday I'm going to have to, like, do classes all the way through the history of Middle-earth. And how rewarding it has been to actually do so, hasn't it? So really looking forward to getting started discussing Morgoth's Ring. Morgoth's Ring is one of my favorite volumes of the series, though I have to admit the primary reason I love this book is I am a huge fan of the Athrobeth of Finrod and Andreth, which comes near the end. I'm really excited to get to that. And we're going to start seeing some initial setup, actually, for that, I think, even in tonight's session. So that's going to be really great. So one thing, let me just say also as a kind of disclaimer before I begin. I have no idea how the schedule for this class is going to go. I've scheduled, I think, 12 sessions for this book. We ended up taking 17 for Sauron Defeated. I don't think we got... I ended up slowing down to a crawl during the Notion Club papers because there's a lot of really, rich, not to say dense material in the middle of the Notion Club papers there, which I wanted to make sure that we kind of worked through as carefully as I could. So... well, that ended up taking a good deal longer than expected. A large chunk of Morgoth's Ring is taken up with the revisions of the Silmarillion material that Tolkien did after the Lord of the Rings. So a lot of it is, like tonight, contains relatively little new material, just looking at a couple newer versions of an older thing that we've already talked about more than once, actually, in the Ainulindalë. So... that's why if you look at the schedule, you will see I have what might at first blush appear to be quite unrealistically large chunks of text set out for us, like tonight. I'm planning to discuss 45 pages of text, more really, because I'm talking about the foreword as well. So we'll see how that goes, but I think we should. We're not going to be kind of going through... like the C text of the Ainulindalë paragraph by paragraph, because we've already talked about most of that stuff before. Instead, what I'm going to be doing, I want us to be, my primary goal in talking through Morgoth's Ring, all of these later texts, is to kind of try to focus a little bit more on the forest instead of the trees. Obviously, I'm a great tree watcher, right, when it comes to that. But again, what I'm interested in is less like, let's track each individual detail. It's like, look at each paragraph and see how each paragraph is different. What I want to be focusing on here is, what are the trends? Like, what's the story here, right? What's happening in Tolkien's creative process that we can see here? So I'm going to be focused a little bit more on the big picture. So we'll see. We'll see how that. We'll see how that works out. Yeah. Okay. So that's my little disclaimer. I'm sure I don't even really need to tell you at this point to take the published schedule with a sort of grain of salt. But we'll see how it goes. Anyway, before we get started, a couple announcements. I won't take as long on these tonight as I did last night because, most of you will have had more of a chance to hear about many of these things. But I just wanted to, I do definitely want to mention them. The first thing I wanted to mention is that we've done a change. We've made a change in the Tolkien Professor podcast feed. Due to a bunch of issues we've been having, and I know many of you are aware, some of you painfully aware of some of the difficulties that we have been facing in trying to wrangle the podcast feed. It's one of the issues with having this old clunky feed that was set up in from podcasting terms, the Cenozoic era. we have transferred that over to a new. We decided to just kind of do a wholesale change, and we have totally changed the hosting program, the hosting platform that we're using. The feed hasn't changed, so the Tolkien Professor feed is still the same. You should still be able to get it and everything, but the backstage things are entirely different. This has two consequences that you will notice, I'm hoping. Number one, and here's where the hope comes in, is that I'm hoping that this will change. This will fix a bunch of the problems that we've been having. Episodes should be able to be posted more promptly, and there should be able to be more fewer issues. That is to say, fewer errors and problems, fewer of the fights we've been having with iTunes behind the scenes and that kind of thing. So hopefully a lot of those issues should be ironed out by this process. The second thing is that since we were doing house cleaning anyway and changing everything behind the scenes, we decided to make a significant change. And that is we've pulled out Exploring the Lord of the Rings to be a podcast feed on its own. Because right now the Tolkien Professor podcast feed has been holding both the Exploring the Lord of the Rings episodes and the Silmarillion Film Project episodes, which makes it a little bit awkward for people to kind of track through. People want to catch up on one, or people who are following one or both, making it a little bit easier to sort of focusing on that, so that if people who want to just watch Exploring the Lord of the Rings or to catch up on it from the beginning can just go to that feed and listen to straight through from the beginning. So that should make things a lot simpler, I think, and be a lot cleaner as a listening experience for folks. So now my primary content is going to be sitting on 3 separate feeds. The Silmarillion Film Project will still be on the old Tolkien Professor feed, the original one. Exploring the Lord of the Rings has its own feed, and of course the Mythgard Academy will continue to run on its own podcast feed, which it's had for a while too. And of course all the video recordings of all of these things are on their playlists on our YouTube channel, as well as they've always been. Or I say always, as they've been for a long time. So yeah, so that's what's happening there, just to kind of explain how that's going to go. Christopher says, will I be removing the exploring episodes from the Tolkien Professor feed? I don't know. So I'm not in charge of this migration. I have people who know way more about this kind of thing than I do doing this sort of thing. One of the reasons that my podcast feed was getting so old and clunky and hard to manage was that it was set up a very long time ago. The other is that it was set up a very long time ago by me. So it's now in the hands of far more competent people. And so I don't know the answer to that, Christopher. But we'll see, I think. So yes, Tomas, you do need to subscribe separately for the Exploring the Lord of the Rings podcast. It's out there on the podcast platforms now. Just search for Exploring the Lord of the Rings, and that should come up, and you can subscribe to that separately. Yeah, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, no, exactly, Christopher. I'm pretty sure the plan is to remove them so that they, there's less confusion and we don't create any crossovers unintentionally and stuff. So no, that's the plan. That's the plan. I believe that's the plan. But again, not in charge of it, so I'm a little hesitant to be 100% confident when I don't know. Karita, great question. The next film session is going to be, that's my next announcement, next Thursday, the 26th. So a week from tomorrow, March 26th, will be episode 1, or session 1, I should say, of Silm Film Season 5. We're going to be starting Season 5. Season 5 is going to cover the part of the Silmarillion from the arrival of men in Beleriand through the Dagor Bragollach. So we're going to get to a lot of characters we've been really looking forward to. The story of Andreth and Aignor. We're going to try to do the entire arc of the story of Andreth and Aignor, actually, which is going to be really fun to try to do. And we're gonna get to do the story of Arthel and Eol, which is one that I've been really looking forward to as well. So anyway, lots of really, really fun stuff going to be happening in season 5. So that's, yeah, Tony says we're going to finish film way before exploring the Lord of the Rings. Quite possibly. But despite how ambitious film is in its own right, and we're planning like 20 to 25 seasons of film, yeah, we still might finish that before we finish exploring the Lord of the Rings. Fair enough. Anyway, so yeah, season 5. So we'll be discussing the arc and the stories that we're covering and laying the groundwork for that stuff on the 26th of March, next Thursday night at 10 p.m. Eastern, same time as we started here tonight. So that is my second announcement. The third thing I wanted to mention is that we are we're doing Signum is trying to kind of help out. Obviously, you know, I don't want to spend too much time talking about current events and the stuff that you know, you would probably rather not be thinking about right now. But I know, you know, Signum, of course, is well aware of the fact, you know, we've been kind of looking around and watching as everyone practically in the world is suddenly trying, you know, we've gone in 3 weeks from being this like sort of oddball little university operating in its totally virtual way, in a way that has made us actively strange in the educational community, to all of a sudden looking around and finding everybody else trying to operate just like us. And we know that this is hard for a lot of people, and that many people are struggling, you know, trying to teach online now, you know, being charged with migrating their courses online, given almost no time to prepare that, and kind of fumbling around. There are many teachers and entire schools and school districts really just kind of fumbling around, not knowing what to do. This, of course, is our world, and we're really comfortable with this. So one of the things that we're trying to do to help people, you know, during the current crisis is to, we're offering mentoring services, both to individuals and to groups. So, you know, for schools, for departments, you know, whatever, if there's a, you know, a group of teachers or again, individuals as well. We do have to charge a little bit for this because it's going to take a significant amount of the time of a significant number of our people to do this, but we're offering this at cost for as little as we can. This mentoring service, we call it the Signum Teacher Mentorship Program. And you can find links to that on our homepage. It's just the Signum University homepage. You can see, of course, our 11 tips for teaching online that we, you know, our faculty kind of pulled together a bunch of suggestions of things that we've learned to try to help people. I did my session on online teaching on Monday night, which is posted to our YouTube channel, which is open to everybody. But again, we know that just general tips only take you so far, right? It's kind of nice to have somebody who is experienced with this and is comfortable with this to kind of sit down with you and say, like, okay, let's talk about what it would look like to try to accomplish your teaching goals in an online environment instead of the classroom that you're comfortable in, right? And so that's what we're offering in the Teacher Mentorship Program. So if you just scroll down a little bit, here is our page for the Signum Teacher Mentorship Program. I encourage you to send an email if you're curious about this, if you want more information or you want to discuss maybe us coming in to work. These are, you know, short sessions. It's not a huge time commitment, just trying to, you know, help people and get some advice. Oh, you're right here. Thank you, Zach. I appreciate that for pointing out to me that I am not yet actually sharing this screen with half my audience. Very good. There it is. Okay. Right. Signum University. Signum Teacher Mentorship Program, there we are. Send an email to mentor@signumu.org, or just click on this email us button right here, and we will, this, you know, gives you more information on the group and the individual sessions, exactly what happens, and, you know, this is just our attempt to help people out here. So, yeah. Anyway, so I just wanted to make sure everybody knows about that. Please do spread the word among teachers. I've got a lot of friends, you know, and friends of friends who are teachers and who are just really at their wits' end trying to figure out what to do. And we really would love to be able to help folks. Okay, so let us now go to the text and talk about Morgoth's ring. So let's first start off by remembering where we are, right? So let's go back as far as The Lost Road, Volume 5 of the History of Middle-earth, right? You may remember that The Lost Road was basically focused on the stuff that Tolkien was working on in the mid-30s, like 1937 especially. A lot of the material in The Lost Road is from that period of time in 1937 when he was essentially preparing the Silmarillion for publication, right? And if you remember the timing on that, The Hobbit is published in September of 2000, in September of 1937, right? So that year, The Hobbit has been accepted for publication, and The Hobbit is coming out, right? In the fall of 1937, The Hobbit is released in September, and it's a hit. It's really popular. Multiple printings are going out, and the publisher is already clamoring for more, right? Tolkien, of course, is thinking, this is the moment, right? This is the moment that I've been waiting for decades now. I've got all this stuff that I could never interest a publisher in, but now, like, I'm popular, right? I've got a publisher who loves my stuff and wants to publish more. The time is now, right, for publishing the Silmarillion. So 1937, especially that second half of 1937, he's buckling down, right, and he's working on the Silmarillion, trying to get it ready for publication, and that's all that stuff. You know, we got the the annals of Valinor and Beleriand, the Embarcanta, the what do you call it? The Hlamas, the Tree of Tongues, right? All that stuff. You know, the revised Quenta Silmarillion from 1937. All that stuff he's trying to get together into what would have been this. You know, you may remember at the time we were talking about like imagining what the Silmarillion Tolkien wanted to publish in 1937 would have looked like. This massive, unbelievable thing with all of this stuff in it, right? But of course, as we discussed when we were talking then about the next volume, about Return of the Shadow, it didn't happen, right? Because the publisher very politely says, gosh, this stuff is really interesting, but what we really want is another Hobbit book, right? So instead, he sort of, Tolkien, that is, sort of sadly puts the Silmarillion stuff aside and sits down to try to wump up a sequel to The Hobbit. And that, of course, is ultimately then where The Lord of the Rings comes from. But, of course, you will remember from our discussion of The Return of the Shadow, which we were just kind of recalling this last night in Exploring the Lord of the Rings class, you know, this sort of wonderful moment of discovery that we had when talking about The Return of the Shadow. We saw the moment in, you know, not the first draft and not near the beginning of the draft, you know, when in the middle of the process of working on this sequel, which had started to take shape now, he suddenly brings the walls down, right? The firewall between this new this fairy tale that he was writing, you know, The Hobbit was not really part of the Silmarillion world. It was drawing heavily from the Silmarillion world, but it was all him recycling stuff from the Silmarillion world. There was not any clear consistency between the Hobbit world and the Silmarillion world. And there are, you know, lots of examples that I could give, and we've talked about this on other occasions before, and I won't go over all that stuff again. But anyway, the Hobbit stuff was separate, right? It was inspired by, based upon, borrowing things shamelessly from the Silmarillion world, but it was not within the Silmarillion world. And then he has that one moment, right, when Trotter, the Hobbit, who would someday become Strider, the Ranger, says, I will tell you the tale of Tenuvial. And that's the moment when all of a sudden now the Silmarillion world and the Lord of the Rings world come together. And the Silmarillion world becomes the history of the world of the story that he's telling. And the result is what happens next, right? Now, we're going to come back to this in a minute because we spent a while, right? We had many occasions in our discussion of the rest of The Return of the Shadow, of the Treason of Isengard, the War of the Ring, and the first half of Sauron Defeated, to observe the ways in which the bringing together of those two things, the crossover of his earlier legendarium work and his later Hobbit invention, right, when he crossed those things over, when he combined those into one big project, one big artistic undertaking in his own mind, that flowered tremendously, right, in the process of The Lord of the Rings, and was an almost incalculable enrichment to the story of The Lord of the Rings. And again, we saw that at many points as we were looking at how The Lord of the Rings developed. Tonight, what we're going to be doing is looking at the other side of that. We're going to be looking at, okay, so we see how bringing those two worlds together affected The Lord of the Rings. How did it affect the Silmarillion? What are the consequences for the Silmarillion project in Tolkien's mind of that connection, right? That's what I think we begin to see here in this volume, which is to me most interesting and really exciting. Now, in Sauron Defeated, but of course, Tolkien, the development here is not completely linear. And we know that there are a couple points in the writing of The Lord of the Rings when Tolkien stalled, right? That is when the writing of The Lord of the Rings stalled out and Tolkien took a prolonged period of time, like a whole year, off from writing The Lord of the Rings and did other stuff instead, right? And in Sauron Defeated, the bulk of Sauron Defeated, Volume 9, focused on some of that stuff that he produced in the middle of that. In particular, a lot of this stuff that came in during the second gap. That is essentially, not quite, but almost between the Two Towers and the Return of the King. So we've got in that moment, and this is the Numenor stuff, right? The Numenor stuff that we were looking at, the drowning of Anadune, the later versions of the fall of Numenor, and the development, of course, very significantly, as we were looking at in Sauron Sauron Defeated, the emergence of the Adunaic language, right, which was really important, a really important part of that entire process. So that thing, the sort of, well, one hates to use the adjective final applied to the noun version in anything that Tolkien wrote, but something like the final version of the final state of the Numenor myth, right, kind of emerged from that interlude. And of course, we can see that influencing the end of The Lord of the Rings. I heard just a brilliant paper. Oh no, and I'm suddenly blanking on her name. Anyone who is there and can remind me would be great. At Texmoot, a wonderful, wonderful paper about the influence of the fall of Numenor on the end of The Lord of the Rings. Oh man, I feel really bad. Megan? Was it Megan? Yes, it was Megan, John. I think it was. Yes, thank you, John. Megan Fontenot. That's her. Megan Fontenot gave a wonderful paper in which she was looking at. She first observed that the downfall of Sauron is described 3 separate times. We get it 3 times from 3 different perspectives, right? We get it from Sam's point of view, right, looking out from the cracks of Doom. Right, and then we get it again from the point of view of Gandalf and Aragorn, right, and on the battlefield, and then we get it again from the point of view of Faramir and Éowyn. And so, like, why the threefold repetition of this? And then she went through and pointed out what to me was really compelling: the parallels between the description of the downfall of Sauron and the description of the destruction of Numenor. And that basically her argument was, he does this 3 times, which is interesting and a little bit weird, but what's most interesting about it is that the thing that all 3 of those descriptions have in common, what connects them together, is Numenor. It was just awesome. It was an absolutely fantastic argument. Loved that. Looking forward to talking about those passages and exploring The Lord of the Rings someday. But anyway, so as I say, that's one example I think that we can see of how the Numenor stuff really had an impact. So again, it's not like he was wasting his time, right, when he wasn't writing The Lord of the Rings. So now in Morgoth's Ring, we turn back to the Silmarillion stuff proper, right? The presentation of the Numenor stuff, the Notion Club papers and the Drowning of Anadune, was like a little bit of a like, we interrupt the, the evolution of this legendarium to bring you this side quest, right, that Tolkien went on as a writer. Like the invention of Adonaic and, the further development of the Numenor legend. So, that was really cool and interesting. But it didn't really kind of move forward either of the overall narratives, right? It's kind of as I said, it's kind of a side quest, it's kind of a side note in a sense, right? Again, we can see the relevance. But here in Morgoth's Ring, we now return to the story which was interrupted by The Lord of the Rings, when he had to set it aside, right, and do that sequel instead, which of course ended up turning into this very long period of time, right? It ended up being more than 10 years, ultimately, that he was writing and working on The Lord of the Rings. But remember also that there was a gap of several years between when he finished writing The Lord of the Rings and when The Lord of the Rings was published. And so what happened to the Silmarillion project? So first, I want to start with acknowledging the very important editorial choice that Christopher Tolkien made here. This is going to be really important for us to keep remembering. Christopher says in his foreword, thus this book, Morgoth's Ring, of course, and as I hope its successor. I love how he's like, not going to just assume that they're going to publish the next volume, right? Thus this book, and as I hope its successor, attempt to document two radically distinct phases that following the completion of The Lord of the Rings and that following its publication, right? So he's dividing it so that you've got that period from like 1949 to 1953, and then after the publication, right? So like the mid to late 50s. For a number of reasons, however, I have found it more satisfactory in presentation to divide the material not according to these two phases, but by separating the narrative into two parts. So he's not going to give us in Morgoth's Ring the stuff that Tolkien was working on in between the end of The Lord of the Rings and the publication, and then give in the next volume the stuff that he worked on after the publication. He's combining those things together, and he's instead presenting them almost like a 2-volume thing of all of that stuff put together. He's going to give us all of the early Silmarillion stuff here, that is like up through the Hiding of Valinor, as he's about to explain, and then he's going to give us all the later Silmarillion stuff, the wars in Beleriand side later. While this division is artificial, I have been able to include in this book a high proportion of all that my father wrote in the years after The Lord of the Rings was finished, both in narrative and discussion, to which must be added, of course, all the material in the volume of letters, concerning the elder days, before the Hiding of Valinor. The next volume will contain, according to my intention, or at any rate, all or at any rate more, of the original texts relating to the legends of Beleriand and the War of the Jewels, including the full text of the Grey Annals, and a major narrative remaining unpublished and unknown, The Wanderings of Húrin. So we have that to look forward to in The War of the Jewels, which is volume 11 of the History of Middle-earth. But I just wanted to make sure that we emphasize this, right? That I emphasize what Christopher is doing here in these two volumes, because we have been focused on the history of Middle-earth, as of course has been its primary presentation feature, right, as a kind of historical development of Tolkien's thought over the course of time, right? And so there's going to be so it's well to keep in mind this sort of warning here that there's going to be some deviation from that plan here. Part of me, of course, well, I don't want to say grudges. That seems ungenerous. Part of me regrets that choice. I would sort of rather be able to, because again, to me, what is kind of most interesting to me is to sort of see if, as I say, my primary interest is in the overall narrative, like the creative narrative, the meta narrative of the story, right? What is the story of the story? And so watching the story develop over time, not within the logic of its own narrative, right? First half of the story up to the hiding of Valinor and the second half after the hiding of Valinor, but rather the different stages of its development in Tolkien's mind as Tolkien's own sort of creative situation was changing and developing over time. I would kind of rather have a book on here's where his mind was and the kind of thing he was doing with the Silmarillion material before the publication, and here's what it was like after. As Christopher says, we kind of get that a little bit, right? But we don't really fully get that. But now look, anytime I complain about editorial choices that Christopher's made, I feel like I need to smack myself, because, like, come on, like, seriously. I'm just kind of being a brat when I do that, because, like, let's face it, the challenge that Christopher, the different challenges that Christopher is confronting here, I mean, it's huge. And, like, I'm sure if I tried to do it differently, it would suck way more than what he did. So, like, whatever. I'm not complaining. I'm just saying that it would be really interesting to me to see it that way. So I just want us to keep that in mind, right? To try to keep dates in mind. Now, the stuff that we're going to be looking at today, the Ainulindalë material, is from the earlier period. All of it is from the earlier period. So we're not going to encounter this situation right away. But I wanted to make sure that we keep all this in mind. Okay. So let's go on and think about that crossover I was just talking about. So this is an important thing that I think too few people focus on. Some people don't know, and some people, I think, don't lay enough stress on this. Think about even what I just said, how I described what happened when he brought the worlds of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings together during the course of the writing of Book One. I talked about how he decided that the Silmarillion material would be the historical background of the Lord of the Rings, right? Those would be the ancient legends of that same world, like they would be happening in the same world. But in Tolkien's mind, and this is one of the things that Christopher emphasizes, which I want to make sure we keep very firmly in mind as we go through. We'll see it, I think, reflected in some of the text tonight. Is this. He says, it is very significant also, I believe, that at that time he was deeply committed to the publication of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings in conjunction or in connection as a single work, one long saga of the jewels and the rings. And the time in question is that time between like 1949 and 1953-54, when he was trying to get the book published. One of the reasons for the delay of the publication of The Lord of the Rings was that he was insisting on this, right? Tolkien tried to play hardball with his publishers, Allen and Unwin, right, who had published The Hobbit and who had requested the sequel, and who, under the circumstances, had been extremely painful. I mean, when you're an author and you miss your deadline by a decade, right? I mean, the publishers can be forgiven from walking away from that, right? They were still willing to publish The Lord of the Rings, despite the fact that it was a decade late, despite the fact that it was nothing like what they had asked for or expected, right? They were still interested in publishing it. But Tolkien tried to play hardball with them, right? And say, all or nothing, guys. Here's the Silmarillion stuff. Here's the Lord of the Rings. Either publish them both or I walk and take the stuff to another publisher, right? And of course, he had another publisher on the line. This is what, many of you will have read or at least have heard of, the very famous and very, very, very long letter to Milton Waldman that he wrote, which you can read much, not all, but much of in the published letters. The letter to Milton Waldman, which is his like long summary and commentary upon the whole Silmarillion, essentially, that's a pitch letter. It's a pitch letter to another publisher who's very interested, and he is pitching the Silmarillion. He's trying to explain how this all fits together, how this is one big story, and why they should publish all of them. In the end, HarperCollins walked away. HarperCollins also said, we don't want it. We'll publish The Lord of the Rings, but we're not going to publish it with the Silmarillion, right? So, he ends up going back to Allen and Unwin, and Allen and Unwin agree to publish it, but not with the Silmarillion. So this was not, but again, so that I wanted to remind you, and you know, for those of you who didn't know about that story, to make sure you knew that that was happening, and it was part of that delay, part of what was going on in Tolkien's life while he was in that first period, the first of these two phases that Christopher describes. But again, I think the thing that even I have often, I think, underplayed or underemphasized, it's not just that Tolkien was trying to get a twofer, right? It's not just that he was trying to use the leverage, to use the book that the publisher wanted as leverage to get the book that he wanted published, right? There is definitely an element of that. I'm not trying to deny that. But it wasn't just that. What it was also was that in his mind, these are one long saga of the jewels and the rings. That in his mind at this time, this had gone way past the firewall coming down. This had gone, the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings, in Tolkien's mind, they didn't just move in together, right? We're not only talking about the cohabitation of the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings in one subcreated world, right? They had been married intricately in his mind. This inevitably has consequences for his work on the Silmarillion, right? The kind of downside of this is that he could no longer just, you know, blow the dust off of all of that old manuscript that he had from 1937, what he had been assiduously putting together and preparing for publication, and say like, hey, I still got this in this drawer right here, right? Because it had changed, right? That's what happens when you get married. Christopher says, how did he see two works of such different tone being published together? Well, Christopher, that's what that's the publishers were wondering too. I mean, it's hard, honest. I mean, I love the Silmarillion, but it's hard not to side with the publishers here, right? In retrospect, it's amazing enough that the Lord of the Rings got published. And, you know, I've often played this game, right? Where if you ask yourself, like, what would a modern publisher do if somebody submitted a manuscript like the Lord of the Rings, right? Holy cow. It's like a miracle that the Lord of the Rings was published in any case, right? But to imagine trying to sell to the public, not only the Lord of the Rings, but the kind of the thing that he wanted to sell, right? That like, as if the Lord of the Rings weren't big and strange enough in its own way, to take not just the Silmarillion volume that we finally get from Christopher in 77, but like the thing that Tolkien was trying to put out in 1937 added to the Lord of the Rings. I mean, that thing would have been like 2,000 pages. It would have been just incredible. I mean, I literally can't imagine. Robbie says it was intended to be published in one volume. I don't know that he was necessarily insisting on one volume. I mean, again, of course, Robbie, as you know, in the end, they couldn't even publish The Lord of the Rings in one volume. But I'm not necessarily sure that he was insisting on like one ginormous tome of all of the material together. But like, how would you even do it? How would you even split it up? It is, I have to say, it's very difficult for me to imagine. No matter how much I love this stuff, I absolutely cannot imagine any publisher. So I can't criticize the publisher. Yeah. So it's it's oh, and Sarah, absolutely. Sarah's asking, is it the length of the content that would have been problematic? Both, much in every way. I mean, holy cow. Yeah, like it's just, yeah, I mean, the length, I mean, you're right. Like the 2,000 pages, that's the least of the problems in a sense, right? Wow. Anyway, just incredible. So, yeah. Well, let's keep going and seeing what we see here. So here we can begin. This is still in the foreword, of course. We can see Christopher discussing some of the things that happened, right? Again, what were the consequences? We talked about the consequences for the Lord of the Rings of the marriage of the two. But how did the Silmarillion change? Christopher says, it seems not to have been until the end of the 50s that he turned again seriously to the Silmarillion narrative, for which there was now an insistent demand. Pause. End of the 50s. End of the 50s. It's not until another decade has passed, after he finishes writing The Lord of the Rings, that he really turns back again to the Silmarillion narrative, the full Silmarillion narrative. That's amazing. Right? And also note that means that it's been 20 years. Now, that time when he was preparing the Silmarillion for publication, that dusty manuscript he's still got sitting in his drawer, right, is 20 years old. Just pause for a second and imagine what you were doing 20 years ago, right? Imagine what you were writing 20 years ago. That by itself is incredible, right? But there's much more to it than that. Again, the Silmarillion hasn't just been sitting there in stasis for 20 years. It got married to the Lord of the Rings in the meantime, right? Christopher says, but it was too late. As will be seen in the latter part of this book, much had changed since, and, as I incline to think in direct relation to, the publication of The Lord of the Rings and its immediate aftermath. Meditating long on the world that he had brought into being and was now in part unveiled, he had become absorbed in analytic speculation concerning its underlying postulates. Before he could prepare a new and final Silmarillion, he must satisfy the requirements of a coherent theological and metaphysical system, rendered now more complex in its presentation by the supposition of obscure and conflicting elements in its roots and tradition. Okay. Keep in mind, and this is another way in which I think a lot of people are really unfair to Tolkien, right? A lot of people say, well, surely after The Lord of the Rings was published and became really popular, he must have, like, we know he really wanted to, like when I say, oh, it was, one of his dearest dreams to see the Silmarillion published, a lot of people are like, well, why didn't he? Right? Like, what kept him? I mean, it's 20 years from when he publishes The Lord of the Rings until he dies. He had 20 years to work on the Silmarillion. Surely. I mean, he hadn't been working on it. He'd barely, like, the 20-year period, that's like the entire time from when he first sat down and started writing the very first of the Lost Tales until 1937, right? When he was preparing it for publication there when The Hobbit was coming out. Like, that whole time period and the way that we saw the story developing there from between Volume 1 and Volume 5 of the History of Middle-earth, that was 20 years, right? He's got another whole period, like, of that entire scope. Why couldn't he get it done? Right? Why couldn't he get it done? And one of the things that Christopher points out is sort of the extenuating circumstances, right? That is the way in which he got absorbed in not just the sort of publication drama that I was describing earlier, but also the aftermath of the publication, right? It wasn't so easy to just put The Lord of the Rings aside and move on from it. And think about all that stuff in Unfinished Tales, right? So, he says here that it wasn't until the end of the 50s that he turned again seriously to the Silmarillion narrative. Why so long? Why wait for like a whole 10 years after he finished writing? Even, 5 years after he published The Lord of the Rings? What was he doing for that 5 years? Writing the Unfinished Tales stuff, answering people's questions, continuing the subcreative process of the Third Age of Middle-earth, right? So just think of all that material. Essays on the Astari and the Palantiri, the Gladden Field stuff, the Hunt for the Ring stuff, the Galadriel and Celeborn stuff, all that stuff. All that stuff basically comes from this period, right? So he was busy, right? He was occupied in the Lord of the Rings world. So the Lord of the Rings didn't let him go necessarily as soon as it was published, sort of the contrary. But more than that, the Silmarillion and the Lord of the Rings had gotten married, and marriage changes people, Think about that. Think about what Christopher says here. Before he could prepare a new and final Silmarillion, he must satisfy the requirements of a coherent theological and metaphysical system. Why? Why? Why do you think? Why is he having all these hang-ups all of a sudden? He didn't worry about that before so much. Why was he suddenly worrying about a theological and metaphysical internal consistency now that he wasn't worried about before? Why do you think? Robbie, I have to think he looked back at revising the Silmarillion with a great deal of dread, knowing that the marriage had changed it a lot in his mind. Absolutely. Absolutely. But it's the nature of that change that I especially want to focus on here. Think back to the Book of Lost Tales, and even after the Book of Lost Tales, think back to the Quenta Noldorinwa, and the Quenta. So remember the early 30 stuff. This is the material from The Shaping of Middle-earth and The Lost Road. If you remember our discussions of those, like 4 years ago now, 4 or 5 years ago. Maybe some of you have binged it more recently. I don't know. But think back to that early Silmarillion material, right? Think about the kind of narrative it is. And you can still hear this. You can still kind of feel this in the published Silmarillion. Yeah, Marie, you're right that the world presented in The Lord of the Rings is different than the world presented in the Silmarillion. And not only that, I would say it has to do with the whole concept, the whole literary frame. The Lord of the Rings is a different kind of literary undertaking. Think of the difference in narrative, right? Think of a chapter in the Silmarillion. Some of them would be bad examples. I don't mean even like of Beleriand and its realms is too extreme an example. Of Turin Turambar is a bad example in the other direction. Think of a chapter like of the Darkening of Valinor, or the description of the kinslaying, right? Think about those chapters. Good, Marie. The chapter on the Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Yeah, think about that chapter. And think about any chapter of The Lord of the Rings, right? Actually, Marie, that's a wonderful example. The Nirnaeth Arnoediad. Take the chapter on the Nirnaeth Arnoediad and put it next to the chapter on the Battle of Helm's Deep or the chapter on the Battle of Pelennor Field, right? Think about the differences between those things. Yeah, Kit, exactly. The genres are completely different. Now, that might sound like a really English professor kind of thing to say, right? Like, who cares about genre? Genre is a kind of thing that English teachers talk about. It's a different kind of story. It's a totally different creative undertaking, right? The Lord of the Rings is not exactly a novel, but it is a heroic romance, technically. But it is attempting a kind of psychological and narrative realism, the kind of experience that it provides, right? It is a consistent narrative told from the point of view of people there on the ground. We almost never get narrative of that kind in the Silmarillion. It just isn't told that way. It's a different kind of story. And if we think back even further, right? Think back to the legend of the, think back to the story of the making of the sun and the moon, right? Especially think back to the making of the sun and the moon as it was in the Book of Lost Tales, right? Remember that delightful story about the flower of Telperion and how they accidentally dropped it, right? And it got bruised, and that explains why there are dark spots in the moon, right? Remember that kind of thing, right? That's that kind of story is a completely, it's in a totally different world. It is attempting something completely different. You don't need the kind of internal consistency. There are a lot of questions that you just don't have to answer when you're telling a story at the kind of mythic and epitomizing, to use Christopher Tolkien's word, level that the Silmarillion was doing, right? Are there theological questions? Yeah, absolutely. Are there uncertainties? Like, does the story give you answers? No, it doesn't give you answers most of the time. But you know what? It's okay. It's not a big deal in the Silmarillion, right? In the Lord of the Rings, you can't do that. It has to work. The experience that we as readers are brought into in the Lord of the Rings is that we are brought alongside the characters of that story, right? We are asked to invest secondary belief in the world of the Lord of the Rings on a totally different level than we are in the earlier Silmarillion material, especially the really early Silmarillion material. Remember how much of the early Silmarillion, like the Book of Lost Tales stuff, remember how much of that was what I called myth of explanation, right? You know, like things that answer questions like, Mommy, why do dogs and cats not get along with each other? Ah, child, let me tell you the story of Huan and Tevildo, right? And that will explain to you why dogs and cats don't get along, right? Why, Mommy, why are there dark spots on the moon? Ah, let me tell you the story of how they accidentally dropped the flower of Telperion, and that will explain to you why there are, but, Mommy, why does Ireland exist, right? So, I mean, these are all the kinds that, remember how often that happened in the history of, in the older stuff, especially in the Book of Lost Tales, but you can still see it in the stuff from the 30s, in the Quenta Nildrinwa and the 1937 Quenta Silmarillion. When you're telling stories like that, the experience of reading a myth of that kind, a myth on that level, that is just miles and miles and miles away from imagining yourself in that world. And like, what would happen if? What does it mean if? What are the implications of this for those other things? The kind of forcing together the kind of forcing together of consequences, right? And seeing how these things all work together. This is what the kind of the genre of story, the kind of storytelling that he was doing in The Lord of the Rings demands, right? The kind of, I don't want to say disembodied is a bad metaphor, but I what I'm tempted to say is the kind of disembodied myth, right, of the earlier Silmarillion stuff. These stories that could just kind of float free. And yes, they raise theological and metaphysical questions, but there's no compulsion to answer them, right? There's no compulsion to answer them. But in The Lord of the Rings, there is, right? you know, because you've got characters asking uncomfortable questions, right? Like Sam on the stairs of Cirith Ungol saying, we're running out of food. Well, maybe we can get food in Mordor. That's if orcs eat and drink, right? Or do they just live on foul air and poison? Well, now we've got to answer that question, right? We've got to stop and think about, where do orcs come from, right? And when Tolkien, when forced to confront, the, hang on a second, I'm having a small hardware issue here, no problem, just working through that here, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, so when he is forced to confront those issues, in the Lord of the Rings, he has to make some decisions, right? The decision that he makes in that moment that I just talked about with Sam and the orcs and whether or not they eat, that has massive implications for everything. Like, you've got to follow the thread there. You've got to make it work consistently. That's what he had committed himself to in the kind of narrative that he was writing in the Lord of the Rings. That's the cost of the marriage, right? Between the so now when he goes back to the Silmarillion, leaving that stuff unanswered, right? It's no longer really an option. Not in his own mind. Doesn't mean he has to explain everything in the story, right? But it has to work. It has to be made to work in a new way. Oh, and P.S., there's another thing, of course, that he did, right? Part of the frame that he chose for the Lord of the Rings was that it's our world, right? When he was telling, and now the Silmarillion was always connected to our world, so that actually in some ways I think is a thing that gets imported to the Lord of the Rings. If anything, I think that works the other way around. That is, the whole idea that the Lord of the Rings is from the prehistory of our world, I think that's something that the Silmarillion brought to the marriage, I think. But anyway, when you can no longer leave these questions up in the air, you're now forced to confront things like science, right? And now he's kind of looking back at those fun old flat Earth myths, right? And the making of the world round and all that. And he's now like, oof, wow, okay, I can't do that anymore. Can I do that anymore? You know? So, yeah. Christopher says, why? Why not simply present the Elder Days as mythology that might not be consistent with the experience of Third Age people? Two things there, Christopher. Number one, because Tolkien, right? Notice Christopher doesn't say that he got caught up in writing the explanations. He got caught up in, what's his phrase? Analytic speculation concerning its underlying postulates, right? He had to think it through. Part of it is just who he is. He needed answers. He had never needed these answers before. He needs them now. He feels he can't go on without them. He can't go back and without knowing the answers. So part of that, Christopher, I think is just who he is, right? But Christopher, there's another problem, right? If the myths, as they are told, were just human myths, and so any way in which they did not fit with reality could be chalked up to ignorance, that would have been an easier out. But from the beginning, the essential, like literally the very first concept, what the whole origin and root of the legendarium was from the very beginning, these are the elvish stories. These are the authentic stories brought from elven home back to world by Ariel Althwina. This is the version of history this is the true unrevealed hitherto story of the elves, which they got in part from the Valar themselves, so it can't be explained. that way. You can't say, well, they just didn't know what they were talking about. If they didn't, who does? Right? I mean, the Valar were supposed to, I mean, what were the Valar laughing up their sleeves? This was one vast practical joke by the Valar against the Eldar, right? That's not a super satisfying frame. Yeah, exactly. It was Tulkas. Yeah, no, that I could get, Christopher. Yeah. I'm not saying there are none of the Valar that I can't see that I can see doing this. It could totally work. Yeah. And so first of all, let me apologize. You guys are making lots of really, really awesome comments, but I'd emphasize the lots. I see one of you who I think is new, Jorge, was asking how you participate. You're doing it, man. I'm sorry if I'm not reading your comments, because I'm getting like 30 every 10 seconds over here. So anyway, it's fine. I'm not trying to discourage you from commenting. That's just my apology if I don't read your comment or I don't read it aloud. I mean, because it's a lot. Anyway, so, okay. Yeah, no, again, please, no, some of you are apologizing now. Don't apologize. I want you to keep commenting. Just be understanding when I can't comment on all of them. Anyway, okay. So, all right. When you think about this from this, to me, this is the number one cost, right? This is the thing that affects this, that will affect the Silmarillion. If there is a single answer, like if there's a one sentence answer to the question, why doesn't Tolkien ever finish the Silmarillion? This is my nominee. My nominee for the answer, the simplest possible answer to that question is because he couldn't make it work. He would have had, it's not just about revising. It's not just about reworking. It's about the wholesale reconception. He's got to redo it all in this wholly new mode to make it work. If it's going to be living faithfully within its new marriage, right, with the Lord of the Rings. And the fact is, it doesn't all work. It's not just that it would be long. It's not just that it's daunting. It's impossible. It can't happen. There's a lot of the early stuff that is just, frankly, impossibly inconsistent with this later stuff. Some of this we know, right? Where do orcs come from? There is no good answer to that question. There is no good answer that works in all ways satisfyingly, because it's an illustration. It's not just a loose end that Tolkien never fully tied up. It doesn't. There's so much that he would have had to abandon, and he didn't want to. And we'll get back to that. See some more of that happening later on tonight. He's hoping. You're going to be teasing me because I'm like, we're going to rip through 45 pages tonight, and we're still on like slide 3. But I'm going to speed up after we get I want tonight's first session. We had to set the stage and talk about these fundamental issues, right? I know we're still on the forward, Yana. I know we are. We're getting there. You'll see how fast we're going to go after this. Okay. Let's get to the Ainulindalë. And so all of these things are, I wanted to just make sure that we're being fair to the project that Tolkien is facing, right? And that we're trying to wrap our minds around sort of where Tolkien was as a narrative author, as a creative artist in this time period, right? As he's returning to the Silmarillion project. Now let's look at some of the things that he was actually doing during these times. And I think we'll be able to see some of the bigger picture emerging. So Ainulindalë stuff. Here's the summary of how the Ainulindalë developed during this period. Now, keep in mind, the dates on this are during the writing of The Lord of the Rings. He does a new draft of the Ainulindalë in 1946. That is during the gap, and the same gap in which he's writing the Notion Club papers and the Drowning of Anadune, right? During that pre-Return of the King hiatus from the Lord of the Rings, he also does the Ainulindalë here, right? So it's not just a Numenor sabbatical that he's taking, right? He is also already beginning, even before the Lord of the Rings is done. He's you guys are awful. You guys are teasing me outrageously about my claims of speeding up. Karina's like, buckle up, kids. It's 0 to 60 any minute now. Yeah, fair enough. Fair enough. Yeah. Oh, Jorge, absolutely. He gets very caught up in the philosophical questions. And as you point out, some of this is going to bear real fruit. The Athrobeth, as you point out, Jorge, that does definitely emerge from some of these philosophical issues, right, that he's working through. So some of it, I think, is really fruitful. Okay. So here's how the Ainulindalë thing works. So Ainulindalë A is the very first music of the Ainur. That's the Book of Lost Tales version. Ainulindalë B, a manuscript of the 1930s. So this is from that period in the 30s when he was beginning to put the Silmarillion into what at the time he hoped would be its publication form. When lending this to Catherine Farrer in 1948, he wrote on it Flat World Version, the story of the lending of the narrative to Catherine Farrer. And boy, talk about unsung people who played a major role in Tolkien's life, right? The evidence that Christopher presents in this chapter suggests, and I don't want to give it more weight than it deserves, but it kind of sounds like the feedback he got from Catherine Farrer in 1948 had a massive impact on the future development of the Silmarillion. Who was she? Wife of a friend? Wife of a colleague? Nancy? It's pronounced George. Sorry, Portuguese, not Spanish. Thank you, George. I was guessing because of the J. Sorry. Great. Okay. Right. So he calls the old version, the version we've already read before in the Lost Road, the Flat World version. A new version, lost apart from a single torn sheet, written in 1946. So he does a revised version in 40. It's been 15 years, right, since he wrote that, 10 to 15 years. So he writes out a new version, sloppily, right? But he writes out a new version, and then does a typescript, right? Because that scrawl is really, really hard to read even for him. So he makes a typescript to send to Catherine Farrer, right? This is what Christopher calls Ainulindalë C*, right? Based on that written text. So he's got the old version, the B version, what Christopher calls the B version, the Flat World version, and then he's written up this much newer Round World version, right? That he sends to Catherine. So he sends them both to Catherine Farrer. And then Ainulindalë C, made after the return of the texts, by covering the old B manuscript with new writing and removing certain radically innovative elements presented in C. It would in this way be entirely explicable, says Christopher, how it came about that the typescript C* preceded the complicated and confusing revision C on the old manuscript, this being the precursor of the last version of the work that my father wrote, Ainulindalë D, made in all probability not long after C. And Ainulindalë D is essentially the version that's in the published Silmarillion. Ainulindalë C* was thus an experiment, conceived and composed, as it appears, before the writing of The Return of the King, and certainly before The Lord of the Rings was finished. It was set aside, but as will appear later in this book, it was by no means entirely forgotten. So, you see what already begins to emerge here, right? Ainulindalë B, the old version, the old flat earth version, he comes back to this in the mid-40s. He's not even done with The Lord of the Rings, right? But the marriage has already happened. So, the marriage has been solemnized, even though, they've not gone out into the world together yet. He sits down now, again, 10 years later, and says, okay, flat world version won't do, right? I can't make that work. I can't do that kind of thing anymore, right? I can't just do these sort of whimsical mythic ideas that are so disconnected I've got to make it all work, right? I've got to make it all work not only with itself, right? I got to make it internally, philosophically, theologically, as well as narratively consistent, psychologically consistent, and I've got to make it make sense in the context of the real world, in the context of like realistic psychological experience of our world. Okay, so I'm going to write a round world version. I'm going to try. So this seems to be something like his first foray into the kind of revision he would have to do. Not just reconciling details and stuff like that, but totally reconceiving the older narrative in order to make it work in the context of the new narrative. Okay. Catherine Farrer doesn't like the round world version. She likes the flat world version better. To which I say, thank you, Catherine Farrer, wherever you are. Thank you, Catherine Farrer. Imagine what might have happened if he had received encouragement for the round world version, right? If these first forays into this like overhauling and reconciliation of this had been well received, and he had begun enthusiastically the process of radically shifting it over, things would have been very different, right? The Silmarillion, my goodness, we might have gotten the Silmarillion, but what on earth would the Silmarillion have looked like, right? Wow. It's, yeah, exactly, Marianne. No straight road, possibly no two trees, right? Now, keep in mind, we just did Sour and Defeated. Well, I say just. A year ago, we just did Sour and Defeated, right? And Mary, as you point out, no straight road, right? Except the straight road and the making of the world round was like the central premise of the Drowning of Ainulindalë and the Notion Club paper stuff. Like that was all over that. Like that was the central conceit of that whole impulse, that entire story. So we already have evidence from the fact that he's doing this experimentation with a round world version at the same time that he's writing the Notion Club papers and the Drowning of Ainulindalë. We already have evidence that like his own, I mean, again, my conclusion, I should say, is that his own secret, like, artist's heart does not want to let them go, right? Those ideas are still inspiring him very powerfully in all of that Numenor material, right? We see all of those things, right, still happening. And yet, while he's writing that stuff, while he's writing the Notion Club paper material, he's also imagining a world in which they don't happen, essentially, right? In which the world is round from day one. Yeah, exactly, George. We would have lost the trees. We would have, yeah. I don't want to pretend, and Josiah, you're absolutely right. Josiah's wanting to play devil's advocate and says, I actually like many of the new ideas that come with the round world version. Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's all bad. And I'm not saying that, like, you know, the Silmarillion version we would have got. I'm not saying it's like, you know, sorry, my apologies for this, but it's the image I'm thinking of in my head. I'm imagining, remember at the end of The Magician's Nephew in Narnia when Diggory is told, when Aslan does what he says he doesn't do and tell Diggory what would have happened, right? If he had taken the apple for himself and brought it back home instead of delivering it to Aslan and fed it to his mom, how it would have worked and things would have like sort of worked out like he would have wanted, but everything would have been horrible, right? So it like... I have in my head here this image of the, like, we would have gotten the published Silmarillion, but it would have been like, you know, with all of its soul sucked out of it and everything. Anyway, I'm not saying it would necessarily have been like that. That's almost certainly an over-exaggeration. And Josiah, you are absolutely correct. There is no question that good came of it, right? Anyway, we will we'll see some more things as we go. But I certainly, as I say, personally strongly agree with Catherine Farrer, and you can see he did too. In response to her letter, he essentially drops the experiment, the Sea Star experiment, and goes back and literally writes on the manuscript, right? Writes the, sets the TypeScript, the nice new TypeScript he's made aside, and goes back literally to the manuscript of B and starts scribbling on it, and just says, okay, instead of that, let me brush this up, right? Let me just make some changes to the B text using some of the stuff that he had done in rewriting on the TypeScript. But he goes back to the flat word version and sort of adheres to that. The effort was good to have been, yet remained evil, Matt. Yeah, though David is wondering if maybe it could have been different, but it couldn't have been better. Who knows? Perhaps so. Yeah. Okay, Stephen Cover was also thinking of the "and yet remain evil" parallel there. Yana asks, do I think he realized how far-reaching the consequences would have been? Yes, no, I do think that. And that's, I think, exactly why he spent much of the rest of the last 20 years of his life in this kind of stalemate, right? That several different impulses that he had were in conflict with each other, right? He knows. I was just saying there are elements in the earlier story that really just can't be reconciled. You would have to lose them. There's fundamental elements you'd have to completely rewrite in the whole story. You'd have to be willing to part with some of these things in order to make the kind of Silmarillion, to make the spouse of the Lord of the Rings in its full form, right, that he wanted to bring about. But he wasn't willing to do. So he saw the conflict, right? And I think that he ultimately spent a lot of that time kind of paralyzed there. Yeah. And Stephen asks how much of it was him picking up Bilbo's habit of writing less and just sitting and thinking more. Quite possibly, Stephen, quite possibly. But Stephen, was it you who earlier on in the class said, I've also heard rumors that being older does things to you as well. And I've heard rumors about that too. That maybe there are other reasons to think that the 20-year period between 1917 and 1937 might not have been that the time between 1953 and 1973 might not have been exactly the same experience for him as his creative work between 1917 and 1937. James says, smile when I say that, young'un. I know. But still, I've heard rumors. I've heard rumors that it can happen. Okay, let's keep going. This is me speeding up. Ready? Some selections. This is from the C text. So this is from the revised Flat World version. The post-Catherine Farrer's intervention version. Never since have the Ainur made any music like to this music, though it has been said that a greater still shall be made before Ilúvatar by the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Ilúvatar after the end of days. Then shall the themes of Ilúvatar be played aright, and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand his intent in their part, and shall know the comprehension of each, and Ilúvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. I wanted to point out this passage because this, I think, is one of those places in which we can see the positive fruit of the analytical speculations that he was doing at this time. Those of you who are at TextMoot will remember. Sorry, it's hard for me not to think back to recent regional moots without a tinge of sadness that we've been prevented having regional moots. Regional moots will live again. But those of you who are at TextMoot will remember that last discussion that we had that I led on the apocalypse of Tolkien. I read aloud a passage from The Shaping of Middle-earth. It's the bit at the end of the Quenta Nulda Rinwa. So not the 1937 version, but the 1933 version, the first time he sort of wrote the Quenta out in full kind of Quenta form. What I'm talking about is the bit at the end when he talks about the end of the world and the Dagor Dagorath and the return of Melkor and how Turin Turambar is going to kill him with his black sword. Remember, you remember that? We were reading that passage. One of the things that I was emphasizing, one of the things that I find really striking about that is there is a philosophical and theological simplicity in what is talked about there. Now it is couched, Maria, exactly as you say, as a prophecy, right? It is said among the Eldar thing, right? It's not, we're not told this authoritatively, as it were. But anyway, when you read that, what you find is that it's really simple. Remember when Sam wakes up at the field of Cormallen and says, "Is everything sad going to come untrue?" Well, according to the prophecy of the Dagor Dagorath, yes, everything sad is going to come untrue. The vision of the sort of that final revelation, that apocalypse of what the end of the world is going to look like, which is the only time Tolkien ever did that kind of thing in his Legendarium. The apocalypse, the revelation that we get there it's entirely a do-over. The Silmarils are going to be brought back together, and they're going to be returned to Feanor, and Feanor will bear them to Yavanna, and the Silmarils will be broken, and the trees will come back, and so everything's going to be happy again. Everything's going to be going to go back and get done over, right? Now, Stephen, I'm not saying that Sam was foreseeing that kind of apocalypse. What I'm saying is, of course, like that brief thought, that expression when Sam says, "Is everything sad going to come untrue?" I take as an expression by Sam, not quite of disbelief, but of that feeling he seems to be having a kind of disconnected experience, right? Like that doesn't happen, right? Just sad things coming untrue is not how the world works, right? So that experience that Sam is having, it's like he's like, have the rules of the world suddenly changed, right? Am I in this alternate universe where this happens? But that was the world. That was where the world ended, right? Yeah, Jennifer, it's like the restoration of Eden. And Matt, exactly. It is Arda unmarred. It's not the healing of Arda, and it's certainly not a new heaven and new earth. It's just a restoration of the old. I say just. But again, there's a kind of simplicity to that. Again, when Sam has that like brief sort of disembodied experience, like the rules of the universe have changed and now, sad things we're not going to grow from them and say, David, like Parrish and Niggle might have said, it could have been different, but it couldn't have been better. No, we're just going to undo everything, right? Everything that was sad is going to get reversed and going to be made happy in retrospect, going back again. That was the apocalyptic vision in 1933. And that, I think, is exactly the kind of thing that when, after the Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion get married, I'm trying to resist extending that metaphor. Um, uh, but yeah, I mean, it's like the Silmarillion. The Silmarillion is married now, right? The Silmarillion has lost its virginity. The Silmarillion is becoming a new grown-up person now, in a way that it had a childlike innocence before. And that the thing that was childlike about it was... I'm sorry. Sorry if you don't like the metaphor, but I couldn't resist it any longer. That is... It had... The marriage brings the Silmarillion into contact with the real world in a way in which it had, and it seems weird to say, doesn't it? Like, you look at the Silmarillion, even in its earlier versions, and be like, are we saying the Silmarillion is in contact with grief, is not in contact with grief and suffering? You know, like it was innocent and naive of bad things happening? No, obviously I'm not saying anything like that, but on this other level, do you see what I mean? That it could be allowed to sort of sit in its sort of isolated little world. It was a world in which you could imagine hitting redo at the end, right? Now he can't. What do we get now? Now we get the choirs of the Ainur and the children of Ilúvatar after the end of days. Then shall the themes of Ilúvatar be played aright, and take being in the moment of their utterance, for all shall then understand his intent in their part, and shall know the comprehension of each, and Ilúvatar shall give to their thoughts the secret fire, being well pleased. It's still a redo, but it's a very different kind of redo, right? This is not just an undoing. This is not just an unmarring, right? This is... thinking through it in new ways. And of course, those of you who know your New Testament will immediately see that in thinking it through differently, more concretely, one of the other consequences, yes, exactly, Mary, in describing Arda remade rather than unmarred, right? He also is coming much closer not only to Christian concepts, but even to New Testament language. For all shall then understand his intent in their part, for then we shall not see, now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. The old version, the Arda remade, was not consistent with Christian ideas. In one way, right? Brian, this feels a lot more like Revelation. Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. Anyway, so as I say, I do think that there are some, and I've always loved this passage. I find this passage very, very beautiful. And I do think this seems to me a much richer concept, a much fuller concept than the one that we got in the old version, the Revelation from earlier on. Good, Christopher. Yes, not to mention being well pleased. Yes, that's very Genesis 1, right? Yeah, exactly. We get some other gleams that come through, right? Even in the C text, remember, this is the revised flat world version, so he's not doing his full round world experiment anymore, but notice what happens here. By the way, some of what this is going to be, and this is going to come up a lot in discussing Morgoth's Ring, your detailed recall of the text of the Silmarillion will be put to the test, and there will be a lot of passages like the one I'm about to... the one I'm about to read, where the game is going to be, can you spot the bit that is not in the published text, right? Can you spot the bit that's different and stands out? In the midst of this strife, whereat the halls of Ilúvatar shook and a tremor ran out into the silences yet unmoved, Ilúvatar arose a third time, and his face was terrible to behold. Then he raised up both his hands, and in one chord, deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, more glorious than the sun, piercing as the light of the eye of Ilúvatar, the music ceased. Which of these things is not like the other? Yeah, exactly. Mary and Marie. The sun. And Stephen, absolutely. The sun. Now, so what? What are the implications of that? More glorious than the sun? What are the implications of that addition? There's the sun, Karina. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Good, Rhiannon. Yeah, it does suggest that the sun is the most glorious thing in Arda, not the trees, right? Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you think about the way that it emerges in the published text, the sun isn't even second best. The sun is third best, right? Lamps, trees, sun, right? In a sense, right? Absolutely. Yes, the sun is a standard for glory, Stephen. That's a really good way of saying that, right? So this isn't even just about the chronology necessarily, because note something here. We have to be careful. This doesn't make any chronological claims. Does this say that the sun existed first? Doesn't say that the sun existed first, right? I mean, heck, for the matter of that, the firmament didn't exist either, but that still makes the published text, right? No, this is just the language, like the similes that are being used by the teller of the Ainulindalë in order to convey, right? This is the description of that final chord in the music of the Ainur. And we're trying, whoever we is, right? The speaker, the author of this passage is trying to explain, to give us some idea of the nature and power of that chord, right? So it compares it to the glory of the sun. Sure, why not? That doesn't chronologically say that it came first. Yeah, but it does still have some pretty serious implications, right? Maria, I agree. More glorious than the sun means the sun is very glorious, but any elf would say more glorious than the light of the trees. You'd think they would. Absolutely, you'd think they would. The fact that the sun is being reached for as a simile here is interesting, right? But of course, another thing that we have to remember. Okay. Sorry, I'm making my I'm about to disagree with Christopher face, which is a face I know you guys have seen before during the History of Middle-earth discussions. Christopher talks about the things that he thinks are the most important differences between these earlier versions and the final published version of the Ainulindalë, or between these versions and the earlier versions of the Ainulindalë. I think he undersells one really, really importantly. And we'll get to that. I'll move on. I promise I'm not going to leave that point behind. We're going to come back to it. We'll see that in just a minute. But just the use of the sun here points to this other thing I haven't told you yet, but it also does suggest we can still see some of these reconceptions, not thinking of the sun in its second place or third place, you know, its second rank or third rank status in glory, but using that suggests that we're already beginning to rethink things in some the basic sort of fabric of the myths in a certain way. Here's what I'm talking about. Any of you do a big old double take when you got to this passage? And many other things the Ilúvatar spoke to the Ainur at that time, and because of their memory of his words, and the knowledge that each has of the music which he himself made, the Ainur know much of what was, and is to come, and few things are unseen by them. Yet some things there are that they cannot see, neither alone nor taking counsel together, as thou shalt hear, Ælfwine. For to none but himself has Ilúvatar revealed all that he has in store, and in every age there come forth things that are new, and have no foretelling, for they do not spring from the past. Nancy says, Ælfwine, she missed that guy. Yeah, okay. Ælfwine, as thou shalt hear, Ælfwine. Holy cow. I'm not sure I can even explain. I would have to do a lot more thinking and working through this, even to try to articulate successfully. I don't think I'm going to be successful at it now. How important, how much of a change it is for me reading it to have the frame visible, to imagine a speaker and, more importantly, an audience for the Ainulindalë. This passage is almost exactly the same as the published text, right? This passage is almost directly out of the published text. What don't we have in the published text? As thou shalt hear, Ælfwine. Christopher completely removed the frame elements from the Ainulindalë in the published text. That, now, again, I'm not just trying to say that Christopher did a crappy job and that he was wrong to do this. There were reasons that he did this, and I think that I'm not saying his reasons were bad, but I am saying it's a massive difference. Massive, massive, massive difference. Yes, the Book of Lost Tales version had an intrusive frame too, James. Matt says, is this still supposed to be Bilbo's translation at this point? Matt, eventually, yes, it is. But I don't think it was yet. And honestly, Matt, that's my theory that's my belief as to why Christopher took out the frame. But anyway, because the frame was changing, but whatever. Exactly, Rihanna. And I think that is the thinking, that if the Silmarillion is Bilbo's translations, then the Ælfwine reference wouldn't fit. Exactly. But the effect that it has on the tone, on the structure, on the sequence of things in the Ainulindalë, this passage is a perfect example, right? There are lots of places in the Ainulindalë when the narrative voice ceases telling us what happened and begins kind of making commentary and kind of explaining stuff, right? And there always was to me when I was reading the Silmarillion in my early days, which of course were for me not as early as for some, as I didn't get the Silmarillion when I first read it in the first time or two. When reading the Ainulindalë, there were a bunch of places where, like, the question, who's talking here, right? Because it sounds like somebody's talking. And what is the relation, if I'm the audience, right? I mean, if this person is like speaking to me or writing for me, the reader of this text, like, what is my relationship with that person? It always felt to me a little bit weird. And now, all of a sudden, right, you just put in the parenthetical, as thou shalt hear, Ælfwine. And I'm like, oh, well, that makes sense then. Of course. Okay, so you've got an elvish scholar, right, who is relating to Ælfwine the writings of an older elf scholar, right? We've got Rúmil, who's from Tuna, right? He's from what will later be called Tirion, right? He's from Valinor, right? pre-exile, the pre-exilic writings of Rumil, the scribe, and now we've got Pengalod, who is the one who's actually sitting down with Ælfwine, the human being, and explaining this stuff to him, and Ælfwine is going to bring it back, and that's where it's going to come from, right? Okay, so, to me, the difference that it makes to reinsert Ælfwine, the Pengalod Ælfwine frame, was just there's so much of it that I'm like, now all that stuff which in the Ainulindalë, in the published text, I'm like, I don't understand the flow. Why are we suddenly talking about this? Like, yeah, how the arrival at Tolkis is of Tolkis is like detached from the rest of the story, and it's like all really weird. This makes a huge difference, and we can see, and so now go back to this. Now you read this passage about the final chord of the music again, but you read it in the voice of Pengalod speaking to Ælfwine, and now all of a sudden makes all kinds of sense, right? Deeper than the abyss, higher than the firmament, more glorious than the sun. Well, yeah, that's him knowing his audience, right? Of course he's going to compare it to the sun. He's talking to a human being. What else is he going to compare it to, right? I mean, he could say more glorious than the trees, of which you've never heard, right? I mean, seriously, what kind of good is that? So what's he comparing it to? The firmament, right? The heavens that you can see above you, the sky. And he's comparing it to the sun, which you can also see, right? And the abyss, which at least you can imagine. Yeah, exactly, Marie. Ælfwine lives in a world of the sun. He lives in a round world of the sun. Yeah, absolutely. So again, we can still see the reinsertion, or the reassertion, perhaps I should say, of Ælfwine as the audience of these stories, with an elvish teller to him, actually is a really interesting tool to try to reconcile the round world and flat world things, right? Okay. Let's keep going. More on the frame. But of all such matters, Ælfwine, others shall tell thee, or thou shalt read another lore. For it is not my part at this time to instruct thee in the history of the earth. And now behold, here is the habitation of the children of Ilúvatar, established at the last in the deeps of time and amidst the innumerable stars. Even that phrasing, amidst the innumerable stars, when I am hearing this in the voice of a storyteller, telling stories to a human audience, sounds more right, sounds better. Sounded weird and stilted when it was just like, I am a historian writing in a book and I'm going to, in the deeps of time and amidst the innumerable stars. Right? Anyway, and here are the Valar, the powers of the world, contesting for the possession of the jewel of Ilúvatar, and thus thy feet are on the beginning of the road. I love that. And thus thy feet are on the beginning of the road. I absolutely think that when Tolkien is writing this, he's thinking about Bilbo's song. I absolutely think that he is. Remember, this is happening, right? This drafting is happening after he's already written at least half of the Two Towers and before he started the Return of the King. The road goes ever on and on is already in his head, right? And here are the Valar, the powers of the world, contesting for the possession of the jewel of Ilúvatar, and thus thy feet are on the beginning of the road. Where does that road lead? You never know what'll happen when you step outside your door, right? Where you might get swept off to. Where's Ælfwine going to get swept off to, ultimately? Where does this road lead? The road that begins with the Ainulindalë? Where does it lead? Answer, the Grey Havens is where it leads. one long saga of the jewels and the rings. The saga that begins, the road that has its origins at the Ainulindalë, ends at the Grey Havens. Jewel of Ilúvatar. Josiah, you were noticing that. That is a really fascinating kenning for the world, isn't it? Christopher explains in his foreword why he calls this book Morgoth's Ring, right? Because the whole world was Morgoth's Ring. All of Middle-earth was Morgoth's Ring. We'll get there later on. But he was showing how the story of Sauron and the Ring of Power really is, from the top down, an echo, a repetition, a type of Morgoth and his relationship with Arda, right? Right, it's all of Arda is Morgoth's Ring, not Middle-earth. The jewels, right? Just as Arda is, Arda and Morgoth are like Sauron and the Ring, so the Valar and Arda are like the elves and the Silmarils, right? You can't compare compare the world to a jewel in the Silmarillion context and not invite us to think of the Silmarils, right? Again, we can begin to see how that saga is working out in Tolkien's mind, right? What exactly that arc is that is connecting from the Ainulindalë to the Grey Havens, right? How the beauty and wonder and subcreative energy of the Silmarils is like itself a synecdoche, a repetition, a type of the creation of Arda, the subcreation of Arda through the Valar, by the Valar, right? Just as Morgoth's relationship with Arda is similarly connected typologically to Sauron and the Ring. Again, we can see just hints, just glimpses of the ways in which this story of the Lord of the Rings that Tolkien has been telling, right, that has been emerging in Tolkien's mind. The Silmarillion, again, it's not just now its background, now they take part in the same world. They really are joined, right? We can begin to see how impractical though it may be, right? Impractical though it may be, to imagine the joint publication of the one long saga, as we were saying. There are ways in which it can work. Now, Nancy's saying that it seems an uncomfortable comparison, right, between Arda and the Silmarils. Yeah, in some ways. Though I still maintain that the Silmarils get a really bad rap. I disagree with how a lot of people talk about the Silmarils. That is like that the Silmarils are cursed and that they are like agents of destruction. They're not. But they are objects of desire, right? They are precious and they are beautiful and they are glorious and wonderful. And therefore, the desire for them can easily go wrong. Nancy, as we see with Arda, on many occasions, right? Arguably, even the Valar themselves. Think about the Valar. Think about the hiding of Valinor, right? Think about the straight road. Do not the Valar, to some extent and in some ways, hoard the beauty of Arda? Or seek to hoard the beauty of Arda? Like do they not lock Valinor away in their vault, right? And begrudge the sight of them to others? Is it uncomfortable? Yeah, it's uncomfortable, right? But Tolkien stories have really never been have really never been afraid of that particular piece of discomfort. Marie, exactly. The Silmarils are holy jewels. They are hallowed jewels. As Marie says, it's not the Silmarils' fault everyone else is so dang possessive. That's exactly, Marie, how I feel about that. Yeah. Anyway, okay. Let's keep going. Look at me going fast. Therefore he willed that the hearts of men should seek beyond the world and find no rest therein, but they should have a virtue to fashion their life amid the powers and chances of the world beyond the music of the Ainur, which is as fate to all things else. And of their operation everything should be in shape and deed completed, and the world fulfilled unto the last and smallest. Lo, even we, elves, have found to our sorrow that men have a strange power for good or ill, and for turning things aside from the purpose of Valar or of elves, so that it is said among us that fate is not master of the children of men. Yet are they blind, and their joy is small, which should be great. One of the things I really like here is the unapologetic, well, I won't say bias. I want to be fair to Pangaloth here. There are many times in the published Silmarillion, again, not getting the frame, right? Since we don't have the frame, we have to remember, we have to remind ourselves. Don't forget, this is not objective. It's without a frame, it sounds objective. All the things that are said in the Ainulindalë sound like they're uttered by the mouth of God, right? Or, Matt, as you say, Martin Shaw, which sounds pretty similar, I always fancy. But anyway, again, it sounds like, doesn't the Ainulindalë sound super authoritative in the with no frame, right? But now again, when it's put in the mouth of an actual elf, right, speaking to a human, now all of a sudden it's very different, right? And here we can see this like unapologetic, right? We elves, right? This is one elf. This is one elf explaining how elves understand, what elves understand, how they look at the fate of humans, right? And he doesn't get it. He's elf-splaining, as Sean says. Yeah, exactly. He's elf-splaining. I like that. I like that a lot. Yes. And Brian, that's exactly it. That is exactly it. Without the frame, the Ainulindalë sounds like scripture, right? It sounds like it has that kind of authority. Yes. Oh, David, I often think of that. David is he's thinking of an analogy for the Silmarils. And the best she can do is that it wasn't Helen's fault that men coveted her. Yeah, no, that's exactly the kind of thing that I think of. Oh, David, the comparison I've made before, and it's one that doesn't help very many people because it's from a book that almost nobody has read, which is book 4 of The Fairy Queen. Book 3 also. Book 3 and 4 of The Fairy Queen. Which almost nobody reads. But there's a character called Florimel, she's a female character, and she's like the most beautiful woman in the world. And she spends literally her entire time running away from rapists. Like everyone, like as soon as any male person sees her, they immediately lust after her. And so she's literally like sprinting. She gets like an amazing amount of cardio throughout books 3 and 4 of The Fairy Queen, because she's always running away from men who are trying to rape her, because she's the most beautiful, sexy woman on the face of the earth. And it's not she's a totally good person. There's nothing wrong with her. She does nothing to deserve it or provoke it. But she is the object of everybody else's desire. So yeah, to me, that's the perfect illustration. It's how I think of the Silmarils, but again, it doesn't help most people. But Matt, Christopher removed the frame. Did Tolkien remove the frame or Christopher? Yeah. In the D text, which Christopher doesn't give us in full, but he gives us bits of it, we can still see the frame is still there in the D text. Christopher removed it. And again, I'm not trying to diss Christopher for making that choice. He has some good reasons for that, and I do think it has a lot to do with Bilbo. But I miss it. I think the elimination of it is enormous. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, sorry. Christopher Bartlett says, I do a double take every time you refer to Christopher Tolkien. Yeah, I apologize. Yeah. Sorry. Not talking about you. All Christopher's present exempted. Okay. We will come back to the elvish perspective on the fate of men. But again, I just want to point out what a massive difference it makes to have like a flesh and blood elf saying these things, right? The limitations of this perspective are clear, right? When he says their joy is small, which should be great, it's very clear, like should be like, from as far as we can see, right? Based on our understanding, like we go like, what's wrong with you people? Right? Like you humans, like you should be really happy and you're not. Like what gives with you? As we'll see, Tolkien will come around to answering that question. The human side of this argument will be voiced by Andreth later on, but not yet. Yes, Josiah, it makes the whole Silmarillion more like the Athrapeth. Maybe that's what I like about it. Yeah. Yes. Good. Yes, David, you're right. This passage emphasizes the grass is always greener aspect of elf-man relations. Each kindred, envies the fate of the other. Yes. And you can hear that here, right? This is not spoken again with that kind of abstract scriptural authority saying that, humans have been blessed in these ways and should really be more grateful. It's instead an elf saying like, as far as we can see, you guys have it good. And of course, humans will and would say exactly the same thing. Yes, Matt, I do suspect that the fact that it was Christopher who removed the frame has a lot to do with why he downplays the significance of removing the frame. I do kind of suspect that. Okay. All right. We're late. That's okay. A couple last things I want to touch on with the Ainulindalë. We'll finish that. You will see that even though I've only scheduled 6 sessions, I have scheduled like four out of the 12 sessions that I've scheduled in this class are catch-up sessions. So I wasn't wholly naive in my scheduling. Anyway, okay. Now that we've laid the groundwork, though, it'll be much faster from here. Trust me. Yeah, that'll be fine. So continue reading next section for next time. We'll finish this up, and then we'll see how things go on from here. So keep following the reading, though I apologize, a fairly aggressive reading schedule, a comparatively aggressive reading schedule, I know, certainly compared to the reading schedule in Exploring the Lord of the Rings. But anyway, thanks very much, everybody, for joining me tonight. This was a really fun session, and I look forward to talking again next week. Bye now, everybody.
The Mythgard Academy has been offering in-depth discussions of awesome books and films since 2013, completely free to attend and free to download. If you've enjoyed our discussions and would like to help them continue, please consider donating at signumuniversity.org/fund.